Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm continuing my trek through all of Mark Calloway, aka The Undertaker's WrestleMania matches. This, of course, is the Undertaker Streak-A-Thon, as I call it. Now, of course, in the last video in this series, we detailed how the streak ended at WrestleMania 30 against the Beast Incarnate Brock Lesnar. Hard to imagine that was almost 11 years ago now, but here's a match that happened almost 10 years ago at WrestleMania 31. This is his comeback match following that against, as he was calling himself at the time, the new face of fear. This, of course, is the late Bray Wyatt. This took place in Santa Clara, California at Levi Stadium in front of an attendance of 67,000 people. And it had a buy rate of 259,000, of course, excluding the WWE Network, which is how I watched it. By this point, I had the network, and that's how I was watching a lot of the pay-per-views, especially around this time, because I was unemployed, and there's a lot of weirdness in the house. I'm not going to get into it here, because it's not where I'm going to air that laundry, but it was there, and it did help me decompress and all that fun stuff. And of course, just as a little side thing, this being a WrestleMania in California, even though I was not working at this time, I'm like, next time there is a Mania out here, if I'm working, I'm going to try my hardest to go to it. And of course, 2 years ago now, I went to the second day of WrestleMania, and I enjoyed myself, even though the ending of the main event kind of sucked all the air out of the arena. But that was a good thing to help decompress from something else. Now, the Bray Wyatt match. This is the second to last match on the card. And since this is mainly an outdoor stadium, it is still daylight when the match took place, which is probably the one negative with this match, and that is that it kills some of the mystique for the entrances. They kind of balance it, which I will get to. The match itself is a little over 15 minutes. With entrances and the other stuff, it's probably closer to 25. And unlike the previous ones, it doesn't really feel like it overstays its welcome. It does what it needs to do. Now, as I mentioned before, if Taker had not lost to Lesnar and you had to have him lose eventually and have the streak end, this is one of the ones to do it. The three near the end that would have made the most sense would have been Punk, Bray, and of course Roman, even though that version of Roman's character was not the best. But at least how that match ended and all that stuff, you could see, if he still had the streak intact, how that could be built up. And plus, eventually, when he became his heel persona, it would have added a little bit more fuel when he brought it up in promos, that he was the one that ended the streak, especially with Heyman being his wise man. Ooh, just all heel heat. But, of course, that didn't happen. The package for this match, I love how it really shows the history of Undertaker's streak, and then shows how it ended, and it goes into the storyline for this match, and that was Bray calling out the Undertaker. He's like, "I'm the new face of fear, Undertaker, you're over the hill." And of course, Undertaker retaliates by setting Bray's chair on fire, saying, "Okay, I'll see you at Mania." And if there's any negative with this build-up, it's that, unlike the previous years, Taker did not make any appearances on TV. Which at the time I was disappointed in, and even looking at it now, I'm still disappointed. Because think about it. The previous year's Manias, he made appearances. The previous 6 years. His 2 against Shawn, his 2 against Triple H, his 1 against Punk, and then his 1 against Lesnar. He made appearances on TV against them. But for this, no. The last time he did this was his comeback match as the Dead Man against Kane. And in that one, it makes sense why he did it, because he was buried alive. And he's playing mind games with Kane, and Kane's paranoia is all the mind game, mystical stuff around it is all you really need that match to build up for it. Especially since Kane's like, he's dead, he is dead, he's not coming back. And then of course how he sold it when Undertaker did come back out. And like I gushed about both in my review of that and when I covered WrestleMania 20 as a whole. Here though, it does kind of suck. At least for the last Raw before Mania, it would have made sense for Taker to make an appearance, even if up on the screen. Be like, "Bray Wyatt, you call yourself the new face of fear. Well, We'll just see about that, because in Mania you will rest in peace. Probably a little bit more elaborate than that, but I think you get the gist. Well, after the package, we get the entrances. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, it still being daylight really kills the vibe. And the reason for that is that for Bray, without the darkness, you don't get the fireflies from the audience holding up their phones. And of course, you don't see himself illuminated by his lamp. So it's kind of pointless for him to walk out there with it. I will say they do add something to it, and that is having him walk out there with the scarecrows. And I love their positioning. Now, having been to a couple pay-per-views and seeing how stuff is done when, for the television audience, they're watching either a hype package or something else, makes me wonder how it must have looked for the audience for them to see the scarecrows being put into place. Must have been quite a scene, because they're like, ooh, Bray's coming out. And then, of course, seeing how they all move as the camera comes into it, there must have been some signal being sent from the cameraman. But I love the movement, and I love how a couple of them, Bray like looks at him like he's giving the signal, and then even one of them he's like touching, like kind of like a Baptist preacher being like, "You are alive, brother Scarecrow." And then, of course, Bray gets in the ring, and Taker comes out. And, of course, like with Bray, since it's still light out, we can't get the darkness that we normally get, so we get a buttload of fog and Taker coming out like he normally is. And his facial hair is a bit different. It's more traditional Undertaker facial hair. Seems to be about in the same shape he was the previous year. Maybe a little bit heavier, but not like heavy like he'll be in a couple matches when he goes against Roman. And the match, it is a pretty decent match. Now, apparently, Wyatt legitimately injures his ankle the day before, and which is why this match has a slower pace. But I think it really fits given these characters. I mean, at this point, Taker is known for being a little bit more technical with his matches. I mean, he's not like Kurt Angle or Chris Benoit levels of technical wrestling, or even Daniel Bryan. But it's a little bit different than how he was earlier in his career, where it's traditional big man choking, slow plotting. He can put on his working boots. Bray, not really the best technical, but he had his psychology and he was a pretty good brawler, so these two could go. But the slow pace after the beginning part where they really go at each other, I mean, they start fighting, or should I say, Taker starts whooping his ass before the bell even starts, and part of that is that going with the whole thing, you can see that Bray seems a little intimidated by Taker, and that of course leads to the opening little salvo. But that definitely explains why it's a little bit slower, but that slow pace helps with the 15 minutes, because if this match had been like 5 to 10 minutes longer, the slow would have just been plodding around. But in a 15-minute match, this slow thing works because it allows them to let the match breathe and get everything in without it being like spot fest, spot fest, spot fest, spot fest. Which for these two going at each other, that would not have been good. Now, there's not really a lot of big spot moments in here, especially as it's just 15 minutes, but, you know, there's parts where one's in control, the other's in control. We get the moves we expect to see. We get old school. We get at one point where Undertaker hits Bray with a tombstone, and of course Bray kicks out, which the thing that really annoyed me is once again on commentary, they're like, oh my god, he kicked out, he kicked out. Thankfully, it was mainly one of the announcers. I don't have notes, obviously, but I believe it was King, which this is the part where you could really tell that at times he was just being there for the paycheck. I mean, he did have some good stuff to say on commentary, mainly when talking about Undertaker, because King is one who's wrestled Undertaker before, and I mean, even JBL in commentary talking a little bit about his history with Undertaker. I mean, both as an acolyte and, of course, as JBL, so there's that. But as I mentioned before, just acting like someone kicking out of the tombstone is new. It's like the last 6 years at Mania, it's always happened at least once. The only new thing here is that it's a newer guy kicking out of the tombstone. So for that, I can kind of get. But at least with Taker himself, he didn't like sell it like, oh my god, he kicked out. Like it's an unbelievable thing. It should be expected to at least kick out a 1 by this point. And of course, Bray really using his save finisher slots, because earlier he stole the chokeslam from Undertaker, which at this point it's expected for someone to do that to him as well. And of course, Bray does eventually hit Sister Abigail on Taker as well. I mean, at one point he's going to try, but Taker gets out of it. The first one he hits on him, it's a very sloppy looking one. I don't know if I'd say it's a full-on botch, but it does look a little sloppy compared to how Bray normally does it. But since with the flow of the match, it's supposed to be Bray quickly hitting it, it makes sense. And of course, get a near fall, which this leads to the big photo moment of the match that I think is probably one of the main things to bring up with the match, and it is what I ended up using for this for the thumbnail, and that of course is Bray getting up and doing his little backwards spider walk thing, and Taker sitting up and looking at him. And of course Bray flips around like, oh crap. And that is probably, if there's any issue to look at and how this match was built from a psychology standpoint, it's making it seem like Bray really is afraid of The Undertaker. I can understand the beginning part of the match where Bray is starting to doubt himself a little bit. They could probably play a little bit with that. But acting like he's afraid of The Undertaker that late in the match, it just doesn't suit. I mean, especially since Taker ends up going over. I think it's pretty obvious, especially if you see the thumbnail before you clicked on this. It's just, I think it's one of the reasons, one of the things you can look at Bray with how he was built. I'm sure to say how he was booked throughout his whole main roster run, that you could see that Vince didn't fully understand how to use him right. Whether it was this classic Bray character, even later The Fiend and all that. Which Hell in a Cell is all I have to say on that. I'll say there were moments Vince did use that version of it correctly, but Hell in a Cell, no. But here it's like, even with Undertaker and him going over, you could have built it up a little bit to where Bray would look strong in defeat, especially since at this point he has already lost some WrestleMania stuff. But it is what it is, and it is make for a memorable moment, because 10 years later we still remember it. And of course Bray does go, after a little bit more back and forth, Bray to set up Sister Abigail proper. Taker gets out of it, and of course Bray charges into another tombstone. 1, 2, 3. Taker wins. And with the streak no longer being there, that's probably why this match and this finish just is one of those ones that's like, and that's a mocking clap, by the way, because it's like, oh good, Taker got his little energy back from him losing the streak the previous year. And that's really all this match feels like, is that it's there to appease the fans of Taker and give him another win back, so he goes up to 22-1. Now, the commentary building up the match and some moments of the match are good, but it just doesn't feel as good. And I had issues with it when I watched it when it first happened, and then watching it back, especially with the little bittersweet note now that Bray's no longer with us. Overall, it's like, I mean, definitely would have been better if it still had the drama of the streak being intact. Would have been interesting if they had Bray go over. But it is what it is. I mean, Bray, he wasn't 100% ended by his loss here, but didn't do him any favors in the long run, especially since he had to switch his character. But of course, what he went to, I think, is arguably better. That's debatably better, definitely. And of course, Taker after this, he would have a couple more matches. Well, technically it's 2 proper matches, then a match, and then of course the Boneyard match. And of course the next match, that's going to be an interesting one to talk about, because that one involves the McMahons and their shenanigans. Of these later ones, this is probably the one proper match you could probably skip, but if you want to watch it, if no other reason than to see Bray at Mania and see him take on The Undertaker, and I think this is the one and only time they actually wrestled each other, that's definitely worth the novelty. I'll say that probably Fiend, Bray versus Taker, especially in the cinematic match, probably would have ended up being better, but alas, that could never happen. That type of match goes in an alternate dimension. Of course, Next time, we're talking about Undertaker versus Shane McMahon inside a Hell in a Cell. And involving a secret that we will never find out that Vince did, but considering what happened in real life after this, what could have been inside? But that's next time. Till then, everybody.